Hello and welcome to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is going to be a course directed towards people who are interested in texts or in an introduction to textual studies. And it kind of borders with a introduction to the English major, right? If you were going to a university and thinking about becoming an English major. This was, of course, my undergraduate major and the area of study for my first PhD. And when we're entering into the study of literature, the study of textuality in English anyway, there are some things that I think that we need to sort of cover at the ground basis that just gets rid of some of the common assumptions that people have, especially people who don't deal with this stuff at the professional level, or if people are becoming English majors. Where I teach, I often teach in urban universities. I often teach to students who are first generation students like myself. I was a first generation student, which means that my parents did not go to university. And I saw going to university and getting a higher education when I was younger, at least, as a kind of way towards class mobility, towards more economic security. I wanted to have a good paying job, and I wanted a life of the mind and to study the humanities, and I had a kind of romanticized view of some of that stuff, which isn't to say that one shouldn't do it at all. But I had assumptions about what that life was going to be, because from the class background that I came from, I saw that as moving up. I placed a kind of status on intellectual life that the broader society that I live in actually doesn't give to it. The broader society that I live in today, I would say, cultivates an air of suspicion around academics. We often hear of academics being called elites, as if we all graduated from Yale or an Ivy League institution, like some of the people who end up going into high positions in government. So there's a lot of cultural filters and suspicions that I think that we need to deal with, especially when we don't come from a background where, we have a long lineage of people in our families who have dealt with higher education. So if you're becoming an English major, and this is just, I'm going towards textual studies here, but for this opening lecture, if you are going to become an English major, we think about, where does English studies come from? And I'll move this down here a little bit so it's out of the way. So you might think, duh, it comes from England. And that is exactly why we're having this intro lecture. Actually, it doesn't come from England. England is, of course, this island, is part of an island anyway. If we're talking about what is properly England, off the northwest coast of Europe. And the oldest English program, at least what's being touted right now as the oldest English program, actually comes from up north in Scotland. So some Scots might be upset with you by saying, claiming that it's English, because of course they're Scottish. So there's a cultural difference. When we think back on the history of higher education, the 1700s was a happening time in Scotland. It was considered a great place for learning and higher learning. So Edinburgh University in Scotland says that they're proud to host the oldest department in English literature in the world, having first offered courses on rhetoric and belles letters in nearly 250 years ago, around 1760. So I want to unpack a little bit of what that means and why people in England would not necessarily be majoring in English literature until much more recently. So at the time, higher education was premised on a study of the classics. So if you went to school, you were going in Europe or in England, you were mimicking Greek and Roman systems of liberal arts. In the Greek and Roman system, the structure was based on what's called the Trivium, which is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. In the United States, where I live today, people still sometimes refer to elementary school as grammar school. That comes from that older model of education. Logic would also include math here, and basic math like addition, subtraction stuff. We're not talking about trigonometry or calculus. Medieval universities added onto that basis of grammar, logic, and rhetoric with the quadrivium, or arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry. And so we start seeing a little bit more distinction in maths, as the English people put it, as separate disciplines themselves. So again, I said kids went to grammar school to study Greek and Latin grammar. The idea was that you already spoke English, so why would you study English in school? All official business was done in Latin, especially in relationship to the Christian church. Studying Greek got you access to the classics in Greek literature, but also to the Septuagint and to biblical study as well. So, as I said, in the 1700s, Scotland was an especially elite place to go to school. The shift to belles letters is a reference to a movement in rhetoric at the time, or the field of rhetoric. Now, classically speaking, the field of rhetoric, if we're going to go back to Aristotle, is the study of the art of persuasion. So you can see how in democratic societies, even early burgeoning ones like Greece and some forms of Rome, you are dealing with governmental structures where there are groups of people, yes, usually only men at the time, who are trying to convince other men to vote, to put military effort or at least money into military efforts for various things. In Greek society, this was called the polis, or the city center. But of course, by the time we get to Rome and you get the Roman Empire, it's the administrative stuff has gotten quite a bit bigger. And so one of the shifts that we want to see early on is like belles letters or beautiful letters, right? That's just French for beautiful letters. French was for a long time considered a higher language to study because it is closer to Latin. So the English as a language, we'll talk a lot more about throughout the class, but English as a language goes through a long period before it becomes kind of the language of empire and domination that we know it as today. So another thing that is sort of emerging in the mid 1700s, and this will explode in the 1800s, is that there's a shift towards more paper-based rhetoric or a document-centered society. So what does that mean? I mean that most of us walk around with ID cards of some type on our bodies at any given time. We have bank accounts, we have credit cards, we are documented and kept track of in terms of numbers. Our society very much worries about people who are undocumented in one way or another. And so this is a gradual shift over several hundred years where we move to a society where every part of our being and our identity is somehow extracted and made to have some sort of representation out in the world. Now, the internet, of course, comes along and does this at an exponential level, right? So, with that shift to a paper based society or a document centered society, we see more and more of an emphasis on individuality. And that emphasis on individuality is going to be a big part of the kind of political, governing, spiritual tendencies that come out of Western Europe and shape a great deal of the modern world. I say here on my slide that this is also an early move towards Romanticism. So the Romantic movement, generally speaking, across Europe, but especially in England for the purposes of these lectures here today, are going. We're talking about the mid to late 1700s, where it first starts burgeoning, and so we see people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Social Contract over in France. And then things hit England a little bit later. So the great classic poets like William Wordsworth were thinking about around 1800, right? The year 1800, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, the great poets, Mary Shelley, who writes Frankenstein. That's not until closer to 1820. And so that movement has been going on the continent, like many artistic and aesthetic movements, like the Renaissance, for example, which started in Italy, moves up and then northwest and eventually into England and Scotland. So there's an emphasis on writing as the written word. So people before this time period, and still during this period in the 1700s, people didn't write papers for universities, right? They participated in public debates, something that you might, if you were in forensics or debating societies in high school, the people who were going to become lawyers, were going to become important people in the public world, had to have oral and verbal debating skills. And so that was the high premium. That's why rhetoric was considered the highest the end point of a person's education. But what we see gradually is a moving away from that external oral debate towards paper-based society. Yes, we have and continue to have an important role of being able to argue like a lawyer argues in a courtroom, for example, that oral rhetoric, or politicians give speeches. And so that kind of communication is important, but we see a rise of written linear alphabetic, so like the way that words are written across the text here, like right to left, left to right in the English language, right to left in Hebrew. So it depends on the language that you're reading and studying. And our languages and the way that we represent it on the page comes to kind of create a feedback loop in the ways that we think about cognition, consciousness, and frames very much the neural pathways that shape our perception of reality. We'll talk more about that throughout the class. So earlier, of course, as I said, students studied rhetoric. And so when we look at Shakespeare plays, which we will look at a little bit in coming lectures, that it's not just the stage drama of the acting, which is an oral form for sure, but we see that Shakespeare, whose audience was largely kind of people who were in university, a lot of people who were becoming lawyers, are a big part of Shakespeare's audience. Now, lay people, of course, uneducated people were part of his audience, nobility were part of his audience, but the movers and shakers of England at the time, if we read some of the biographies of William Shakespeare, we see that there's a very literate class. There's a lot of jokes about being in school itself going on. There's a lot of allusions to classical education and classical thought. And this is a way of basically Shakespeare was communicating what he knew to the people who might be in school, the people who might be becoming lawyers, or some sort of public officials that were coming to his plays at the time. And so there's quite a bit of rhetoric. Just the study of rhetoric shows up in Shakespeare's characters in his dialogue all the time. We're going to look at in coming weeks this book I am particularly fond of, by a French writer, Raymond Queneau, Exercises in Style. Raymond Queneau is part of the Oulipo movement, which is an acronym. It stands for the Works for Potential Literature. I'll talk more about them specifically. It's generally a French-based group, although there is one American that I know of in the group. Harry Matthews is a writer. And so this is a mid-20th century movement in French literature that combined oftentimes formulas. It's a group of literary writers and mathematicians who are thinking about constraint-based ways of making literature. So we'll say more about that. He writes a book called Exercises in Style, and the reason why I'll be digging into it in coming weeks a little bit, and if you're taking this class for credit, you'll have to do some of these exercises in style, is because Queneau gives us a little bit of a taste of what education might have been like in the late Renaissance or the early modern period, with a high emphasis on style as one branch of this broader term rhetoric. So in general culture, like outside of universities or outside of school, people generally think of rhetoric as a sort of bad word, but within universities, rhetoric is it's itself a field with a multi-thousand-year long history, especially in the West. And then we can think about things like ancient Indian rhetoric from the country of India, for example. So rhetorical style and what is appropriate rhetorically will change throughout culture. So that's a much more sophisticated field in the 21st century today. If we think about it a little bit more broadly, if the classic model of rhetoric was the art of persuasion, convincing other people to be on your side, the way that we think about what persuades somebody in the 21st century, think about our cookies feeds on your computer. If you look for a jacket online, and then all of your social media just for the next several weeks is just going to show ads for jackets, things like that. All of that subtle framing that is being done by algorithms and technology goes into the processes of persuasion. And so when we're thinking about rhetoric in the 21st century, or persuasion in the 21st century, we have to think at a much deeper level about things like identity, cognitive framing, which is a big part of recent work of mine, and not necessarily being convinced in the particular moment, like somebody saying, I disagree with you, I'm going to logically argue with you and persuade you to change your opinion about something like that. That's not the way that things happen. More structurally, like in the United States, if we think about the recent Supreme Court rulings that have been contentious, for example, those rulings change not only the one particular issue, but there are so many other issues attached to it. So the study of rhetoric becomes quite complex. So we will look at rhetoric heavily. It's, of course, that's my first PhD is in English rhetoric and theory. So I have a lot to say about that. When we look at the study of English and language and the way that it starts being brought into education systems, as I said, people in England were not learning English when they went to school. It becomes present first as a part of the process of colonization or colonialism. And I assume that a lot of people have a little bit of a sense of what colonialism is. but it's going to be a word that's thrown around a lot in my lectures. So I pulled a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary: the principle, policy, or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country and occupying it with settlers. The principle, policy, or practice of maintaining colonies. Also, occasionally, an instance of this. Because I do a lot of work with indigenous worldview, I will frame even the existence of the United States as it exists today as a colonizing entity. Because for Native American people, they live under colonialism and colonization today. Sometimes people use the term as a term of the past, like the colonial era, but I tend to emphasize its ongoing features, because there are people living beneath colonization today that trace their lineages back to well before those colonizing structures and governments existed. So that says something about just the framing and the perspective I have for my classes. So part of the work here comes from a scholar named Gauri Viswanathan, who wrote a book called Masks of Conquest. And so when Viswanathan was doing research on the early 1800s in England, the research here is based on like newspaper articles on material history, right? This is one form of literary inquiry and literary theory that focuses on what Stephen Greenblatt calls cultural poetics or new historicism. It's also associated with the term postcolonial theory, which I will say more about because I was just talking about colonialism a minute ago. So Viswanathan says this in the introduction to Masks of Conquest: the amazingly young history of English literature as a subject of study is less than 150 years old, and around 1989 when this is written. It's frequently noted, but less appreciated, is the irony that English literature appeared as a subject in the curriculum of colonies long before it was institutionalized in the home country. As early as the 1820s, when the classical curriculum still reigned supreme in England, despite the strenuous efforts of some concerned critics to loose its hold, English as the study of culture and not simply the study of language had already found a secure place in the British curriculum. So this is what we want to think about, that the intention to provide English education first arose in the colonizing efforts of what became the British Empire. At least if we're talking about the English language, right? This doesn't mean that there weren't colonizing efforts by the Spanish, for example, but the English were very intentional about this. And so this was an article called "On the Inefficacy of the Means Now in Use of Propagation of Christianity in India," published in a newspaper called the Oriental Herald. Obviously, it was about the Orient, right? Which is, for the English people, their term for the East. The article says, by giving young Indians a taste for arts and literature of England, we might insensibly wean their affections from the Persian muse, teach them to despise the barbarous splendor of their ancient princes, and totally supplanting the tastes which flourished under the Mughal reign, and probably Mongol, right? Make them look to this country with veneration, which the youthful student feels for the classical soil of Greece. So the intention here, when we think about colonialism, just think about, like, if you walk into somebody else's house and you want to convince them, you think that they should, convert to your religion. not usually going to go very well if you just try to convince somebody to completely change their faith. So the intention here among the English colonizers was to create a system of education that focused on the English language and English literature, and through that to shift the tastes and the thinking and the whole attitude of life among people in the colonies in India, for example, in this particular um, article, to shift them to the things that English people valued, and especially to their religion, Christianity. So this becomes very important. You cannot sort of separate Christianity out from the impulses towards colonialism and empire. As my Osage friend and former professor, he's retired now, Dr. Tink Tinker says, Christianity is colonialism and colonialism is Christianity. And that's one way to think about it. Not just in England, but across all of Europe, right? So we have colonizing powers from Portugal or from France or from Italy or from Spain. They all operated with similar attitudes. There might have been a little bit different ways of administering their colonial governments in different places in the world, but they all sort of stem from what Dr. Tinker and I call a Euro-Christian background. So that's lowercase, one word, Euro-Christian. We're not talking about a religion by faith that you might think of it as today, so not a capital C Christianity. That's a bit later conception of religion, but a social movement that is so saturated within people's thinking, within government itself. At the time, there's no conception of a separation between church and state. That's much later. And a lot of my students in the United States have come with that idea, or at least the valuing of a separation of church and state. But of course, we know that even, as I already mentioned in earlier recent Supreme Court decisions, that the blurring of church and state values, that religious values anyway, if it's not one specific church, still are debated, even in a society that claims to value a separation of church and state. So when we look at English studies, and if you're becoming an English major in a university, this is history that you need to think of coming in to any kind of program. This is what you inherit. Now, there's been a lot of movements since then, and part of like the way that I think of and all of the critique that I'm doing right now is because I am aware of this history, right? But it's nevertheless history that cannot be ignored. So when we look at a map of the British Empire at its widest extent. So this is from 1920, just a little over 100 years ago. All of the countries in red here are part of the British Empire. Now, remember that, of course, the eastern edge of what is now the United States was, of course, also British colonies. And so there was a little bit of shrinking, but at the same time, this is considered its widest extent, 1920. So English studies is inherently tied to British colonialism. What Viswanathan says in Masks of Conquest is that after there's these burgeoning education systems in the colonies, there are multiple movements on the European continent, and there are revolutions. Of course, the American Revolution, the French Revolution is much closer to England. And there's a big fear in England that what happened in France, where the aristocracy or the rich people are being overthrown and monarchies being deposed in the late 1700s, that it's going to happen in England. And one of the tactics in England to prevent that from happening was to try to create a situation where middle-class people shared more values with upper-class people. and a greater separation between middle class people and lower class people, because the revolutions that were happening in over on the continent were uprisings where you had a lot of lower class peoples banding together and overthrowing the upper class people. And so the idea in England was to create what becomes eventually a public school system that allows middle class people some access to not just literacy, but to the refined things that might be considered a pathway into an upper class tastes, right? So a bit of an education and to appreciate the classics, right? Maybe you don't need to study Greek and Latin, but you can study what's important in terms of the history of art, the history of literature. You give them a sense of national sensibility and national pride. So great writers like Shakespeare, who we will be reading in this class. Shakespeare, at the time of his death, did not seem to care about whether or not people read his work or whether it was published in print. But later on, English people got together and they collected his work together, and they created this idea of Shakespeare as the national bard. And he is definitely influential for that reason. But Shakespeare, the person, didn't seem to care that much about it after he died and after he retired. So we need to think about, when we're studying literature and textual studies, we need to think about the processes of power and the reasons why certain authors, certain texts become privileged or become recognized for the things that they are as classics, what makes a classic, who decides what a classic is, and how that sensibility is propagated out onto populations of different people. Especially if you're going to become a teacher, this is stuff that you need to be thinking about a lot. The famous phrase for the English or the British Empire in the 1800s, early 1900s, was "the sun never sets on the British Empire." And so you see this map, and what you see, you might associate the term multiculturalism with movements from the 1990s, but look at the way that the British people are presenting their empire here. So they have these like Native American looking individual here, people in India, people of all different colors, skin, people from animals from Africa, animals from Australia. Here's a kangaroo over here. Here's a pioneering guy with like a speculator or something, some sort of a miner. Asian folks over here, all considered part of the British Empire itself. So this was the depiction of the empire towards its publics, and a sort of expression of self-knowledge if an empire has something like that. And so all of this mapped onto the colonized parts of the world, what I call a Euro-Christian fantasy structure. I've written about this in my book. This is a fantasy structure, and I use the PH because it's like a psychological fantasy, right? Imposed a model of civilization onto the rest of the world, placing Europeans as the most civilized. So the idea became for Euro-Christian colonizers to go into all far regions of the world and to civilize and to Christianize the people who lived there. And part of that meant through a kind of education that was vertically based, that if you become educated, you are moving up in the world, up in status, up in rationality. And so in the Euro-Christian fantasy structure, men are usually placed at the top. They're considered to be more rational than women, who are closer to nature. Children are closer to nature until they grow up and become educated. children are closer to indigenous people, and indigenous people are closer to nature and to being children, and they must be civilized in order to become recognizably rational. This is all, of course, racist, ethnocentric, to say the least. And yet it was a big part of a process of colonization. And those structures are with us today in many instances, especially if we're thinking about more recent debates and concerns about institutionalized racism. When we look back at the Euro-Christian fantasy structure, imposing this model of civilization on the rest of the world, we see the roots of a lot of that stuff. So Viswanathan is just one writer. Masks of Conquest, I think it's a good book, and I think it's a book worth reading if you're at the outset of your foray into textual studies and literary theory. Viswanathan's perspective is informed by what we call today post-colonial theory, which is a late 20th century literary theory. And it comes from a time and period after World War II when Europe's hold on colonies around the world Europe loses its grip in many cases because Europe has been destroyed in the war. And so the economic power structures that held things together just aren't there anymore. So throughout the 1950s, you see like all sorts of liberation movements across Africa, India in 1948. We see all sorts of conflicts that will be ongoing in the Middle East, going back to partitions that happened at the end of World War I. And then you have various island movements as well throughout the Caribbean, and then various conflicts in South America as well. So Southeast Asia, Vietnam, all of that sort of stuff that characterizes a big part of global politics in the late 20th century. So post-colonial theory comes out of that, and I just want to put a little tab on it in lecture one here, because for indigenous people today, it's very important that there's nothing post, there's nothing after. They are still living under colonization. So indigenous studies or indigenous theories are not post-colonial theories. They might be anti-colonial theories, and we'll talk about that kind of stuff. But post-colonial studies as a field in literary studies, now we have a little bit more of a historical gaze and a place to put that as a particular set of ways of thinking, and it's not that people don't still do it today, but the discourse has changed significantly. A classic book, if you're interested in literary theory, I still think that this is an important book. Comes out around 1980 by Terry Eagleton. He is a Marxist critic. We will talk about what Marxist theory is. Does not mean that you're a communist necessarily if you're a Marxist critic, but Eagleton is a Marxist critic. And his book was widely taught for a long time, so it's a good book to dig into if you're starting out or just trying to educate yourself about this sort of stuff. Yes, the field has changed a lot in the past 50 years, but it's still a good read. So some examples of literary theories. We shift a little bit towards what we do if we're studying text as literature. We see phenomenology, hermeneutics, reception theory, mythological or typological theory, formalism, new criticism, structuralism, and semiotics. Post-structuralism or deconstruction, or Derridian deconstruction, sometimes as it's called, psychoanalysis, gender, feminist, and queer theories, new historicism or cultural poetics, which is associated with the thinker Stephen Greenblatt, who I will refer to a lot because he's our one of the foremost scholars of Shakespeare today. And for example, it was his biography I was thinking of a few minutes ago when I talked about William Shakespeare. Will in the World is Greenblatt's book on Shakespeare. Narrative theory, ethics and aesthetics, political theology, which is something I traffic in quite a bit. These are some of the terms and some of the ways or lenses that we might look at a text or a literary text. And there are rules and guidelines that follow each of these theoretical ways of looking. And that's kind of what a theory is. It's associated with the eye, right? It looks at something, and just like a different lens that you might put into a different microscope if you're studying cells in biology or something, you might have different filters that highlight or bring out different aspects or qualities of whatever the thing is that you're looking at. That's a good way to start out thinking about literary theories. There's a broader discourse that we might just call theory itself, which once you have enough of the kind of individual definitions under your belt, then you can kind of see that theorists use these discourses as different ways in, or as tools for analyzing different types of text. It depends on what you're looking for. But the broader discussion, in order to have that, you have to have some of the basics underneath your belt. And so sometimes people start off in their undergraduate years, for example, really focusing or honing in on one or two particular critics or a particular school of literary criticism. I think that can be useful. And then there are limits to it as well. Why study theory itself? Well, think about theory at a broader level than even just literary theory. One of the reasons why we have a discourse called theory, which is very abstract, it has nothing to do with people just trying to sound smart because they want to sound smart. The first is that no one can read everything. And so a kind of discourse, a way of interacting with people arises so that you're not continually having the conversation of like, well, have you read this? Have you read this? Have you read that? Have you read that? No, I haven't read that yet. Oh, I heard it was good. I think I've heard of that. And those kind of little power relations that are really all about like people performing how well read they are. I think it's a good thing to aspire to be well read, but that's not the game that we're playing in the professional world. Nor are we playing a game about taste and what constitutes good literature. For example, when I read Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth, for example, when I'm reading slave narratives, I'm not reading them thinking like, oh, this is just a beautiful piece of literature. I just love my Sojourner Truth, and I admire, deeply respect, and I have just like the utmost respect for a writer and a person like Sojourner Truth. Of course, how could you not? But that doesn't mean that I'm reading Sojourner Truth's slave narratives for pleasure, right? Then I'm just like, oh, that's a really good book. Yeah, you should read that book. It's not about taste, right? When we do literary period work, we sometimes have to read novels that are crap. We have to read the stuff that didn't become famous, so that we have a better sense of what was going on in the cultural historical fabric of the time period. And so that's what we're doing. I will push again and again away from taste-based types of criticism. That's not what people pay me for. I don't think that I should be paid just to say what's good or what is not good, what is quality literature. That comes from these older taste-based models of literature that were really about upper class people trying to teach lower class people to value the same things that they valued, and to basically not to overthrow them. If we take critics like Viswanathan and Terry Eagleton and their perspectives into account. So another reason why we need to think and talk about theory is that everyone brings some sort of cultural background to their reading. And so we need to be aware of our own cultural backgrounds. Sometimes we need to interrogate them. And we need to also have a kind of limit, like, and know that there's, or we need to have a little bit of humility about the perspective that we might be bringing to texts and the limits that our perspectives might have. And that could be historical, that could be cultural. Um, uh, we also have theories so that we can connect to scholars both inside and outside of literary studies, right? So theory or literary theory is one discourse, but philosophers use books to make points a lot. Historians use books, use literary books, and they make different arguments with those books across the different disciplines. And so when we are approaching people who have specialized knowledges in different disciplines than our own, theory or the discourse of theory gives us a kind of glue, so that we might be reading a theorist like Michel Foucault, who isn't trained as a literary um, uh, uh, analyst or critic at all, but whose thinking has been very important, nevertheless, in the history of literary theory as well. So, and then finally, because the production of criticism continues to inform the production of literature. So, what do I mean by that? It's not like you have just on the one side literature and then the people who study it. We have now, over several centuries, a history of people commenting and reading and writing about literature, of writers of literature who have studied in literary programs, who are working with the theory of the novel, for example, which we will look at with Mikhail Bakhtin in upcoming lectures. And maybe not, they're not looking at the writers who deal with the theory of the novel for a set of rules or prescriptive rules, like I'm going to write it this way. But maybe they're looking at those rules or those tendencies in order to break them. So when we think about a genre like the novel, which means new, the word novel just means new, we see that it's part of built into the genre of the novel is the idea that it's always emerging or transforming or changing. And so having a sense of how it has developed or changed over time is going to give you an edge if you're a writer. Also, if you're a writer who's looking to be published, it is going to be the literary establishment that decides what is publishable material. If you're looking to get like a book out on Simon and Schuster, like a really big publishing company, who decides? Who are the tastemakers? And when it comes to commerce, when it comes to literary culture, when you go into bookstores and on the end caps in the United States, the end of aisles are up on display, and you see lots and lots of books that are dealing in one way or another with issues of gender, with issues of race, for example. That tells us something about our cultural moment. It tells us about what people are buying and what people are selling or trying to get people to buy. And any writer who is wanting to make a career of writing is going to have to be aware of that kind of process, right? Who makes and shapes literary production? So these are all questions that we'll be looking at over the next several lectures. The study of literature, just from the beginning here, I will ask people to be always thinking fluidly about what a definition of literature is, but we've seen, at least since the late 60s, a big broadening. So like in a lot of English studies or literary studies departments now, people are studying film, people are studying TV as literature. So the study of literature for me and for the next several lectures is about the study of meaning, but not just the meaning how we determine meaning, but how meaning plays a social function in our lives. This is not about your own personal favorite book, whether or not you personally identified or disidentified with a particular character or protagonist in a book. Sometimes it is the protagonist who is deliberately written by the author to be an asshole, to be mean, for example. So we don't want to approach things just in terms of identification or disidentification, even though our consumer culture that we live in cultivates that in our personalities every day. I like this, I didn't like this, and that's what people say, like, I just like this and didn't like this, and then all discussion's done. It's just like, I liked it or I didn't like it, thumbs up or thumbs down on my Facebook page or whatever. We want to dig a little bit deeper in our textual studies. So we're worried about how meaning plays a social function in our life. And I will say this over and over again. For me, literature is about the social ways we use language to encode and memorialize desire. Desire is the thing that we lack, right? If I want to have a hamburger for lunch today, it's the fact that it does not exist in my stomach right now that drives me towards finding a hamburger to eat for lunch or whatever it is I'm going to eat. So desire is this kind of the language comes from psychoanalytic criticism. Desire is a way of lack. So literature is a way that we can look historically at the way a society uses language to encode desires at the social level. Just as language precedes us, just as no one watching has 1%, 100% knowledge of the English language, but is nevertheless proficient and at least enough to understand me. The field of literature is also an open system, so it's dynamic, it's opening. It's not just about a closed set of a canon that constituted the classics back in the day. When we look at ideas of canons, we're really looking at social competition for power by certain groups of people, right? Now I want to shift a little bit to, from I've given a brief definition for literature here, and I want to give now a definition for text. So just again, online etymology dictionary, I use it quite a bit. I'm very interested in word histories and the concepts that accompany them. The word text means web, right? It comes from this Latin, the word web. So when we think about the internet that you're going to be you are watching this on, it's not on the internet yet as I make this. A text array, to weave or to join or to braid together. Everything that you look at on the web is in some way constructed by writing, even down to the binary codes of ones and zeros, right? So when we're thinking about a text of study in this class, we're not just talking about a book. We could be talking about a short film, a long film. We could be talking about I don't know, the ingredients label of a product that you've bought from the store. Now, whether we don't tend to read those types of things as literature, for example, and so it gives us a little bit more of a sense of the categories that we're bringing and the labels that we're bringing to the things that we look at as texts. Increasingly, we're living in a kind of a TV renaissance where people are binging over several hours long shows, and that is being produced, yes, by the writers who wrote the script and the dialogue, but also by the media entities, the big companies like Netflix or Amazon or Hulu that you're watching those programs on as well. And so the study of textuality or textual studies is much broader, of course, than just the English language itself. And when we think of it, of our future lectures as dealing with text and textuality itself, it frees us up from just thinking about the language that we might be using to talk at one particular time, although I will be giving these lectures in English. And I think that a lot of the people watching are interested in becoming English majors in English studies. So that is my background as well. I have backgrounds in religion, as you will hear in future lectures as well. But that gives us a basis for thinking about textual studies and what we might be doing in a course on textual studies. If we go back to English studies and as we end here, there are major branches, and different universities have different sort of emphases on these areas in their programs. So literary studies is going to be the classic study of literature. Yes, it was books mostly, but remember that, Shakespeare wasn't considered high literature for his time period. The novel was not considered literature. At least early on, what became to be studied as literature. So poetry for a long time was considered high literature. Now I feel like a lot of my students are scared or suspicious or afraid of poetry, or people who are creative writers who claim that they're poets. A lot of times when they're starting out, that's code for I don't want to have to follow any rules, which actually when you study poetry, there are lots and lots of rules. There are lots of conventions. It's a highly, highly attentive way of thinking about language. So the assumptions about these genres are something that we might have to deal with. But like I said, it's especially since the late 60s in literary studies, there's been much more of a loosening of what constitutes literature, or capital L literature itself. So film and cinema and TV studies show up in English departments. Traditionally speaking, creative writing, and oftentimes that was seen as different than rhetoric or composition studies, people who are going to be teaching freshman composition or technical writing. Sometimes those areas work well together. It depends on who the personnel are working in a program. Sometimes they can be pitted against one another. Linguistics, especially when I teach, I've taught quite a lot over the years at Metropolitan State University in Denver. The linguistics department there is housed within the English department, but in other universities, linguistics, which of course deals with other languages than English, might be housed separately. It depends. That's all about universities and department fundings, structures. And then, of course, there are the people who study English because they want to become English teachers, especially at the secondary or high school level as well. So those are major branches, and you don't have to be going into English studies in order to benefit from these lectures, but I feel like a lot of people are. And I feel like you need to have a sense from the outset of that history of English studies and colonialism, to have a sense of why criticism and theory and the study of texts works in the way that it does. Another thing that you might think about is this comes from a composition studies scholar named Deborah Brandt. So rhetoricians like Deborah Brandt have pointed out that our culture that we live in today has become a society of writers as opposed to a society of readers. So if you think about the 19th century and you think about authors like Karl Marx, or like even the early 20th century, like Marcel Proust, these people who write like multiple volumes upon volumes of texts, right? Long books in the 19th century or in the 1800s, when books were expensive and you couldn't just go to the bookstore every other day or just have it delivered to you like on Amazon with a few clicks. like one big long book is a good quality purchase when you think about like a 19th century like novel like Little Women, which is a really long book. But when I teach it to children's literature students today, they're like, oh my God, this is so long. And it's like, yeah, but it's it's going to last a long time, those stories, just like when you commit to multiple seasons of a TV show on Netflix, right? Those are sometimes quality, like binge worthy, as we call them, TV shows. So the long 19th century novels like Charles Dickens were about that kind of serialized form that we now see in TV shows today. So we've become a society of writers as opposed to readers. And what Deborah Brandt means by that is that the youth in the 21st century write more than any generation in human history, but they tend to consume and produce short bursts of information. So there isn't a lot of long thinking out of things. And so, as always, for somebody in my profession, the emphasis on helping people develop critical lenses, to develop the way to have discourse about things that are beyond personal identification. These are things that I highly value and why I do the things that I do. Especially because we live in a culture that is kind of swipe right or swipe left, like instant gratification culture, which over time can make people think that they have all of the answers to a problem with the minimal amount of information being taken in. And so we need to think about more critical ways of how to process and deal with information itself. And what happens when you have people who are just sort of like spewing things? And we're not talking about everybody posting on blogs, although that happens a lot in our culture. But we're talking about short text message exchanges, right? That those little ways of texting over and emailing and social media, writing that happens with our fingertips. That's where composition studies people are seeing that people write more than they read. I get university students on a regular basis who say it is that my class is the first time that they finished one entire book. That is really different than thinking about the way that literature or literary studies or textual studies might have worked 100 years ago. So from the outset of this course of these lectures, we should consider the expectations that we have when we come to a text. Do you look at a whole bunch of text and your eyes just glaze over and you don't read it? When I look at a text on my phone on the New York Times, for example, it will now tell me 2-minute read, 5-minute read. Internet language is broken up into short bursts of information because it's easier on our eyes. But how long will people scroll, right? These are things to think about, our habits of what we do when we encounter with a text. You should ask yourself at the outset, do you tend to believe texts? Do you go with the story no matter how fantastic it is? Or do you approach a text with suspicion? Many people outside universities today, for example, view, as I said earlier, academics with suspicion. So what assumptions do you have? Like what assumptions do you have about me watching this? Are you encountering this video just on YouTube, or are you enrolled in a course that you've paid money for credit? Things that you want to think about. Just take a little bit of a self-assessment for how you tend to think about the texts that you encounter. And if they're packaged in a certain way, do you tend to read them differently? Do you read texts online differently than if they are in one of these bounded forms like that are on the shelf behind me, for example? All things to think about. I think I'm going to end this opening discussion right there. we're heading into a series of lectures from the Critical Theory Center on Mikhail Bakhtin and his great book, or collection of essays, really, called The Dialogic Imagination. We'll be thinking about the study of the novel. We'll be thinking about Twelfth Night, which is an ongoing project of mine to read Shakespeare plays and to provide contextualized readings. Many of them exist on my YouTube channel or in various courses that I've published over the years. So feel free to look there. If you are encountering this online, feel free to support us on Patreon as well. I provide these lectures to the public as well as to university students at the same time. Thanks for watching and have a great day.